Here we are. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. This is the Monterey County Black and Brown Solidarity Coalition. We are here today for this special webinar on Black identity and spirituality. And before we get started, I'm Luis Chago Juarez, and I'm going to go ahead and start with a land acknowledgement. Acknowledging this land that we are on is native land. What is now known as Monterey County includes the ancestral lands of the Ohlone Nation, Ohlone Costanoan Esselen Nation, Rumsen, Amamutsun, and the Salina Nation. Those who cared for these lands for thousands of years. This land of mountain ranges, valleys, marshlands, and chaparral was once one of the most densely populated native lands north of Mexico. This changed with the arrival of Europeans. Spanish invaders constructed missions along the California coast, and the number of indigenous Californians dropped immensely from hundreds of thousands up in the 500,000 range to a very, very low number. I don't have that number right now, but we know the impact is evident and apparent. And when the gold rush started, it changed everything. California became a state. The government perpetrated ongoing genocide against our native peoples, against our native families, and many of the leaders of these mass murderers were rewarded with positions in state and federal government. To this day, our indigenous folks are still here. Our indigenous families are still here. The Ohlone Costanoan Esselen Nation is fighting for their land, their burial sites, for federal recognition of their tribal government, and to protect the land and water. As we know, this land and water here, specifically Salinas Valley, the agricultural lands of the Monterey County are extremely valuable, so many levels, and this land is now being worked by indigenous peoples from Mexico and Central America, with tribes known as the Zapotec, Mixtec, and Triqui. And so we wanted to mention that, pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture, and hopes for First Peoples, these lands, and all our relations. So thank you very much. I want to go ahead and officially hand this off to our hosts, beginning with Miss Asya Guillory.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd ask that we just kind of collect ourselves. If you have an opportunity to get a piece of paper, we're going to be sharing some heavy material and a lot of information. So if you want to take notes, I advise that you take an opportunity to do that now. If you want to light your incense, however you want to set the intention for today. We are going to start with a very well-known spiritual, and then we're going to have Pastor Artis Smith lead us in prayer shortly thereafter. So thank you again for the introduction. Thank you for the Monterey County Black and Brown Solidarity Coalition, and we'll be starting in just a second. Please enjoy. This is Sweet Honey in the Rock and Wade in the Water.
Si ocupan interpretación de inglés a español, por favor imprimen el botón ahí abajo donde dice interpretation. Parece un globo. I just informed for any of the monolingual Spanish speakers on this Zoom, if they need interpretation, there is a selection right at the bottom.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, when God's gonna trouble the water, come on and wade in the You gotta wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, now you see those children all dressed up in white. God's gonna trouble the water. You know they must be the children of the Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, now you wanna wait in the water. Wait in the water, children. Wait only in the water. I'm telling you, God's gonna trouble the water. See those children dressed in black. God's gonna trouble the water. You know, they come a long way, ain't turning back. No, no, no. See the children, they're dressed up in blue. You know my God's gonna trouble the water. I see it looks like my people, they're coming on through. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water. Well, everybody knows just wait in the water. Wait in the water, children, wait in the water, children, wait in the water, wait in the water. My God's gonna trouble the water. See those children dressed in red. My God, He's gonna trouble the water. You know it must be the children that Moses led. My God, He's gonna trouble the water. See those children all dressed in green. God's gonna trouble the water. You know they're moving down to that Jordan stream. Well, God's gonna trouble the water. Come on, children, down, wait in the water, my children. Wait in the water, my children. Wait in the water, children. Wait in the water. Wait in the water, my God's gonna trouble the water. You know, some say Peter and some say Paul. My God, my God. Well, you know there ain't but one God made us all. God's gonna trouble the water. Everybody ought to just wait on the water. Wait in the water. Wait in the water. Children, wait in the water, my children. Wait in the water. You know my God's gonna trouble the water. Wait, my God's gonna trouble the water. I know my God's gonna trouble the water. My God's gonna trouble. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water. God is gonna trouble the water.
Shall we pray? Dear God, in the name of Jesus, we ask that you come against strongholds. We ask, God, that you come against any demonic influences, any spiritual attacks and bondages. We believe you have the power and strength to conquer the darkest enemy, break the strongest barrier, and silence the greatest deceiver. Your name is worthy, gracious, almighty in power, and we claim victory today in your name. We thank you for those who have gone before us. We thank you for those whose shoulder we stand upon. We thank you for those who have organized this most important event.
Mm.
And even right now, as we cry out to you, we realize that you are in control of everything. And because of that, we ask right now that you would send your mightiest warriors to fight this battle for us.
Mm.
Lord, to you, the darkness shines as bright as the day. Shine your light upon us. Free us.
Mm.
Give us peace. And then snatch us back from the enemy's grip. We surrender our lives, jobs, home, children, and family to you. And may you be praised and thank you for what you are about to do. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Daniel, if you can move on to the next slide. It wouldn't be fair to not start out with a Negro spiritual, to not include music when we talk about spirituality. So thank you so much. That first video was Common, Black America Again, and you heard Sweet Honey in the Rock with a Negro spiritual Wade in the Water. So thank you again. We want to thank the Creator. Thank you, Pastor, for that beautiful prayer. We want to thank all of those that came before us. We want to thank our ancestors, those that are with us, and those that will come after us. Pastor, if you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about who you are.
Yes, thank you, Asia, for opening us up with that spiritual, and it always takes us back to a good place. And so we want to welcome once again all of you who have joined us on today for this most important topic on identity and spirituality. My name is Artis Smith, Pastor Artis Smith. I'm the pastor of the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church here in East Salinas. I have been pastoring at this location here on King Street for approximately 15 years, going into my 16th year. I was raised in Southern California, in Los Angeles, if you will. Had my schooling and rearing on the east side. Went off to Cal State University Northridge, joined the military for about 7 years, traveled around the world, and then came back and settled on the peninsula. I'm married to Lady Sharon Smith. We have 5 beautiful daughters, Brittany, Danielle, Alexis, Faith, and then Gabrielle. And so we have a very busy life. My parents are of the descent from Louisiana, reared and born in Shreveport, Louisiana, to be exact. My grandparents are from Gonzales, Louisiana, from the old background. And so they migrated here to California, and that's where they reared their family. And so I'm proud to be from the California descent, but with a Louisiana background. Thank you.
Next slide. I'm Asia Guillory, and I have lived here on the peninsula for about 17 years. I was born in Georgia and was raised in Oakland, California. And my parents, my mother was born in Oakland in the 40s, and my father was born in Louisiana also in the 40s. I decided to come here to go to CSU Monterey Bay. I've been passionate about Black history since I was in 6th grade when I gave my little elementary graduation speech, and have consistently just sought out for more knowledge. I think history is really important, and it does define who we are and who we show up as and what legacy we leave. My grandparents were both from Texas. My mother's parents were from Texas. My father's parents were from Louisiana. I'm not sure about where, but I also want to keep in mind that even though we are here at this particular time, everyone who has come before us in our family lineage has an impact on who we are. So we thank our elders, and we definitely want to acknowledge the struggles that our grandparents and their parents and our ancestors went through. So we're going to go to the next slide, and I want us to all kind of think about this. And we're going to open it up a few times during this presentation. I want to hear your thoughts. Like I said, this material can be, it can be triggering. The experience being Black in America is one that is a lot of times misunderstood. So I want you to just take a moment and look at all of those boxes you could possibly check when it comes to identity, right? We got African at the bottom and what African means, mulatto, Negro, Creole. I didn't even know Pastor was from Louisiana. That's a whole nother story we have to talk about later on.
Yes.
But how all of these things come in to shape our identity, the regions that we're from. And when we migrate, what we take with us, right? Religion, spirituality, language, and culture. So just marinate on this for a minute. And I want to open it up if we can, if people have some thoughts, just on like, what do you think impacts Black folks' identity here in America and throughout the diaspora? If anyone would like to share.
Asia, if I
I don't
may,
know.
give
Go
me
ahead,
a,
Pastor.
I'm not sure if anyone is chime in. I don't see any questions that are being posed, and I'm not sure, Daniel, how would people be able to talk to us so that we can have a kind of a open forum, if you will?
So you can use the QA icon at the bottom of the screen or the
Okay.
chat function for panelists.
Okay.
So feel free
Okay.
to put any questions in the QA section or in the panelist section
Okay.
of the chat.
So if you will, if you have questions or you want to chime in or create a dialogue with Asia and myself, please do so. And like she said, it's going to be kind of an open forum. But while you're thinking, when you look at these words or these I guess not definitions, but things that we've been labeled down through the years, especially Black, and I'm 55 years old, and I've been through several of these different designations growing up. And so when you think of the word Black, it's a racialized classification of people, and it's usually a political and skin color based category for really a specific population with no mid to dark brown complexion. And one thing I understood in doing some studying is that not all people considered Black have dark skin. And this is a nomenclature when we call people Black. In certain countries, often in socially based systems of racial classification, and in the Midwestern world, the term Black is used really to describe persons who are perceived as dark skinned compared to other populations. And so with that being said, just a little bit, of background of how we became to be called Black, if you will. And so it goes into a little bit deeper than that, but I see that there was a question and it went away.
Yeah, I did speak to the gentleman who posted the question about racism and how that does impact our identity. And we're going to be talking about that throughout this whole
Yes.
presentation. But our experience with oppression is tied to our experience with liberation, right? It goes hand in hand. So I do want to just talk about the origins of Africa, and we're gonna drill down into that. But to think about the regions of Africa and how we can have someone who's Nigerian, who's coming from West Africa, and look completely different from someone who's coming from North Africa, right? Algeria. So even when we think of Africa, I want to like kind of do some myth busting for you to realize how vast of a country, how vast of a continent Africa is and all the countries that exist. There's over 50 countries in Africa. So even, what you were taught about Africa, what you were told about Africa, we need to kind of shatter some of those ideations, right? So when we're talking about identity, even here in Salinas, right? The fact that I'm from Oakland, the fact that Pastor is from LA, that's part of our identity. The folks that came here, and Pastor's going to talk about Fort Ord, it was a mix of different Black folks from all over the country, right? Some may have even been international. So how we're socialized in these communities, how oppression shows up, how this looks and how we're educated, how it looks in the job force. And for those of us who have reached to the middle class, how wealth and education, both Pastor and I went to the CSU, right? So we got a college degree. How does that show up when we're talking to folks who are not college educated? So all of these things I want you to kind of put into perspective. And like I encourage you to take notes. I encourage you to sit with this information and start conversations in your own family and with your friends and in your circles, because this is bigger than us. So we can move on to the next slide. I want to be mindful of time. Um, I'm not seeing my video, but I put the lipstick on, so I sure hope y'all can see me. I could have kept my headscarf on. So as we think about Africa, what I want you all to think about just for a moment, I want you to keep in mind, it was mentioned last night by Ms. Tamisha Smith, that even though we came from Africa as slaves, we were involved in a rich culture. There were empires. There was a long legacy of civilizations taking place in Africa prior to us arriving in America, right? So I want you to think about what I was saying, how there were tribes that had different cultures, that had different beliefs. They were practicing Islam in Africa longer than anywhere else in the world, right? And even the birth of Christianity, the Israelites and Hebrews, how the types of foods that they ate were different. And I want you to also think about Africa before it was colonized. So the rich history of Africa is often gone overlooked. And I want you to just take a moment and close your eyes, right? And think about what you were taught about Africa. And what comes to mind when I say Africa? Africa. Africa. So whatever came up for you, I don't know if it included royalty. I don't know if it included Mansa Musa, the first millionaire known to the world. I don't know if the gold that was excavated from the West Coast and the ivory that was taken, why it's called the Ivory Coast, comes up for you, right? I don't know if you think about the diamonds that are in Namibia. I don't know if you think about all the cocoa that is distributed around the world that comes out of the heart of Africa. I don't know if you possibly thought about the rainforest and how the equator is right around the belt of the Congo. I don't know if you thought about the beginnings of human evolution coming out of Africa, Homo habilis and Homo erectus. And I want you to sit with that. Why is it that those kinds of things don't come to your mind? Queen Nefertiti may not have popped up in your mind. Queen of Sheba may not have popped up in your mind. Prophets, sultans, right? We think of Hannibal fighting off the Spanish on an elephant, right? This is a Black man fighting off armies. And I want you to think about this idea of gender and equity and how we had female leadership in Africa long before this whole idea of feminism, right? So we're going to be talking about spirituality a lot, and it's all interwoven in identity and how Africa is a vast, diverse continent that, you know, gets a lot of misinformation. And why is it that we don't hear that rich history, right? So when you even think of indigenous practices, and those of you who are of Latin heritage, you're going to see some mirroring that shows up for you. And the drums, right? And when you think of your Native American dancers and how they have shells around their ankles, I want you to think of Zulu warriors and how they had shells around their ankles, okay? I want you to think about the beat of the drum. I want you to think about the komal and the incense, and that some of those things are shared heritages and they're part of rituals and religions that really did come out of the heart of Africa. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about how many different times Africa was basically attempts at colonization. We have countries who speak French, right? We have the Portuguese, and a lot of British armies came in to try to conquer Africa many times, right? Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't. And we still look at Africa today, right, being monopolized. So I want you to keep all of that in mind when we talk about identity and we talk about being African American and what that means. You know, how my son is telling me, Elon Musk is from South Africa, right? So he's an African American. So think about those labels and identity and how they show up. Okay. So we can move on to the next slide. I don't want to go on too long. So a lot of you may be familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, and they estimate it was about 14 million Africans taken to the Americas. And I am going to spend a lot of time on slavery. And I was thinking about this. Why is this important? Because we had 6 generations of descendants of Africa in this country and in the Americas that endured some form of slavery or indentured servitude. So it's important to keep that in mind. The gentleman who asked the question about oppression and racism, why these two go hand in hand. So some of you may be familiar with the Middle Passage, and if you're not, like I said, go on. You got all kind of Google and Wikipedia. Look into these things for yourself, right, and make meaning and interpret them for yourself. And a lot of times we think, oh, slaves just came to America. They came to Carolina and they went up the Gullah Gullah and the Georgia, and they went up north to Philadelphia and they were sold. But I want you to look at this map, and I want you to keep in mind that we have slaves in South America, we have slaves in the Caribbean, we have slaves going up to Europe, we have slaves that remained in Africa too. Let's tell that story, that there was slavery going on in Africa before we brought slaves to the Americas, right? So when you think about that, what comes up for you, right? What kind of experiences did these folks have? And you have to keep in mind different cultures, may have spoken different languages. You may have seen your cousin chained up with you. You can't talk with him or her. You might have seen your uncle, and people were stuck, stolen in dungeons, right? And you think about this for weeks at a time, for months at a time. What does that do to your spirit? Chained up. And whatever bodily functions you got going on, sorry, you chained up. And then to be put on a ship going God knows where, with no kind of faith to know what your destiny is going to look like. So we have to keep in mind that even though we did have some slaves that were indentured service, and what I mean by that is eventually they were able to become free or they were able to buy their freedom. We had descendants from Africa who came to America who would die as slaves, who then their children would die as slaves, who then their grandchildren would die as slaves. And you start seeing policies that come up, particularly in Virginia and southern states, that continue to oppress slaves and descendants of slaves. And it would impact the institution of marriage. It would impact the institution to acquire land or education. So the gentleman who brought up the question regarding oppression, yes, is very much interwoven into our experience here in the Americas. But that's not to say that we had slaves that also went to the Caribbean, right? And even though there were plantations and things going on there, they had a completely different experience, right? So we're going to talk about how language shows up, how we have those who look of African heritage in Latin American countries, right? And Chago mentioned all of the tribes that were actually here in what we call America, over 500 something nations. So don't doubt for a minute that we weren't mixing, okay? And then keep in mind that a lot of folks, not everybody was down with the okie doke, just, oh, I'm just going to be a slave and this is all I'm going to do. We had a lot of revolts, and I know that it was talked about in last night's webinar regarding Nat Turner. But I also want to keep in mind that there were more subtle ways to fight the system. And I'll talk about, just real briefly, we had Henry Box Brown. This one brother decided to ship himself to freedom, okay? We had Ellen Craft, who was a very fair-skinned woman who dressed up as a man with her husband. So we had slaves that were able to go all the way up northern through Canada. We had slaves that were able to come on down to Mexico. And we did have some slaves that did get on ships and made it back to Africa. And the country at the time was what we call Liberia. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Pastor, did you have anything else you wanted to chime in about the Middle Passage and the 14 plus million slaves that came to?
No, I appreciate the background historical that you've given, and I think you're spot on. And I just wanted to really chime in on this third bullet where it says countless slaves risked their freedom. and uh, and so many emotions rear up in me, and I'm sure in most of us, when we think about, even though that this was so long ago, that we're still risking our lives for freedom. And I, even though we're talking about and we're bringing it forward, I don't want us to ever forget that we're still risking our lives for freedom. And what a tragedy it is for us to be, what a tragedy it is for us to be Americans and born free, to
Amen.
still be fighting for freedom. And I want to make sure that we keep that in the forefront of our minds. Thank you, Miss Asia.
Okay. Next slide, please. So we look at the transatlantic slave trade, right? And I mentioned language. I mentioned how, look at all this money here. You see, I know this isn't the best photo, but we got rum coming out of the Caribbeans. We got cotton upon cotton. We got gunpowder, whale oil, money, 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 and more money off the backs of African descendants. So we have to keep in mind that free labor and cheap labor continues to sew together the cloth of America's quilt. Let me just say that first and foremost. There was a lot of money to be made during the slave trade. And you want to also keep in mind that even though these were dire situations, it did create some opportunities for travel, right? And I want to just give credit to, we're human. So even if you do not have the ability to read and write, if you are picking cotton from cane C to cane C, you best believe you're gonna get clever and say, how can I do this shit quicker? I mean, let's just be rational. If you out here trying to dry out tobacco leaves to be shipped all over the world, pretty soon you're gonna say, I don't really feel like doing all this shit. How am I going to think of a more efficient way to dry these tobacco leaves? So we've got innovation that's happening. We've got manufacturing that's happening. We've got slaves who came to America already having the ability to sow the land. We have slaves that came to America already knowing how to herd cattle. So we have to not discredit what was already, what skills and what innovations that they brought with them. And just the fact that if you're doing something over and over again, chances are you're going to get innovative. Chances are you're going to get creative at how to do it more efficiently, right? So we have to also keep in mind, due to oppression and racism, some of those things were not credited. So a lot of Africans who came to the New World didn't get credit for those innovations, right? And we got to think about how much money, how much sugar and sugar cane and molasses was coming out of the Caribbean. Who made money off of that? We got to think about the cross-cultural knowledge, because somebody had to ride on the ship to get the stuff back over to Europe. Somebody had to ride on the ship to get the whale oil. And we start seeing explorers like Michael Henson is one who went all the way to Alaska. Soul Brother, number one. He got to learn how to communicate with the Eskimos. You have to think about folks that are in the Caribbean, right, who are eating plantain. And how is it that they eating plantain? Because they was in Nigeria eating plantain. Hello? So think about all of these arrows are basically showing the interconnections that we have. And I put down at the bottom to think about the diaspora, because we really do have people of African descent throughout the world. And we can look at slavery and we can say, oh, it was horrible. It was. And we're still dealing with the post-traumatic slave syndrome. But we can also see the gifts that slavery gave us as a people, an opportunity to travel, an opportunity to diversify. And then I'm going to talk about religiosity, right? So for those of you who may be familiar with Catholicism, you have the saints. And in Nigeria, we had the Orishas, right? We had the 7 African powers. So you start to see some blends that are happening. Islam, folks were writing in Arabic and speaking Arabic before they came to the Americas, right? So how does Islam begin to show up? And Pastor's going to talk more about how the religions began to create new branches of belief systems and ideologies. And then you think about all the missionaries left. And I don't know how y'all feel about this, but the Quaker folks, they had the Bible in one hand. They might have been growing some oats, but they was also letting our people go. They were also part of abolition movements and things of that nature. So we're starting to see that this mix of culture, this mix of religion, this whole idea of mestizaje, those of you who identify as Latin, the Spanish had come to Mexico. You've got Afro-Latin folks in Costa Rica. You've got people in Honduras that look like me, but hablo español también. You've got folks in Oaxaca that look like they're straight out of Africa. So what is happening is there is a mixing that's happening, a sharing of culture. And I always like to bring it up in the food because I am probably gonna get hungry. But like I mentioned with the plantain, we've got paella, a greasy rice with the little mussels and the shrimps in here. And we got jollof rice over here in Ghana. Hello, we got arroz con gandules in Puerto Rico. Ain't that all rice with some tomato and some onion and a little grease? Hello, y'all listening? I hope you're there. So I want you to see these parallels, and you know, Pastor wants some jambalaya.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
these are the origins. These are the origins of who we are, and this is how we show up through culture, through cuisine, through language. Any questions? I feel like I'm talking too much. What's going on? I see a question about why do we start our heritage at slavery here? I did talk about Africa. I'm not sure when you came on. Um, Malika, Maika, I don't want to mispronounce your name. We did start with Africa earlier on in the presentation, and I talked about ancient Africa, and I talked about how there was royalty and there were empires there. Perhaps you may have missed that. I talked about pre-colonialization. So it wasn't mixing with the natives. In this particular diagram, do you want to speak? Can we allow this person to say something? Please, I'd like to hear your voice and share a little bit more about what you were talking about.
Okay, hello?
Yes, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Please share your thoughts.
Well, in regards to my question,
You should be
I
able
do
to
understand
unmute your mic now.
did I'm not unmuted?
Yes, we
We
can
can
hear
hear
you.
you. We can hear you. Go
Okay.
ahead, dear.
So my question isn't that you didn't start in regards to ancient Africa. I did see the slides where you discussed that. My question is more in reference to the fact that when we discuss the transatlantic slave trade, we rarely discuss the fact that only about 6% of those slaves came to mainland USA. And so there were actually Africans here already. And so I rarely hear that discussed about the Africans that were here in the Americas, all throughout the Americas. In fact, the Mongoloid phenotype was not the majority phenotype when it came to natives. If you look at pictures of West Coast Indians and Mississippi River Basin Indians, you see the Africanoid features of afros, wide noses, big lips. Even if you go down into South America, and this was even confirmed by Europeans that came to mainland America and referred to these people as Negroes or Black.
Yes,
and so
ma'am.
I just feel like that when that's left out of the discussion, and even I know the part where we were talking about slavery, I mean, you had a lot of slaves that escaped and they ended up joining Native American tribes. And it wasn't because they just, well, I'm from a Savannah, so I know I can, I know I can navigate grasslands. A lot of times it was because they were returning home. So I just feel like that part is always missed, like that our root is not directly from Africa for, all the descendants of slaves here. Some of those Africans have been here for thousands of years. So it's a mixture of the 6% from Africa and the natives that were here that were also of an African stock.
Yes, you bring up a very good point. And I also want to mention that there were Africans that were traveling to Spain. The Moors is another story that we don't hear about. They were already in Europe and
yeah, because they were in Europe from 1711 to 1492, and we don't discuss that. I mean, they're the reason why, Europeans, a lot of Europeans have the hygiene habits that they have. The reason why they corral their animals, because the corral was an Ethiopian word meaning that you separate your animals. So yeah, I mean, it's just I feel like we either, I don't know if we avoid that history or if we just are not like critically questioning certain things. I know one of the things that always came in my mind was that, you know, we always talked about the Underground Railroad, but you had slaves that ran to Florida because it was Spanish territory. You had slaves that ran west. And I'm like, well, how are these people doing that if they're not from here? But they're doing it with me.
And we had the Buffalo Soldiers. Yes, you tell another chapter that is often not spoken about. All of the migration that happened, and there were free blacks here. I remember hearing a story of John, a Negro. He had been in Philadelphia and had several descendants that were already here in America. And I would even ask you to share what are your thoughts about why we don't talk about that, sister? You could share that real quick.
Well, I think it's just with all history, the deeper you dig, the darker it's going to get. And, you know, it then calls into question what we're taught. Because I mean, even with us having this talk right now, a lot of the things we're discussing still aren't in American history books.
Yeah, you're right. Pastor, you want to speak to what she shared? And thank you for sharing, dear. Do you want to add anything to that, Pastor?
No, I really think she is spot on. And one of the things that we're doing on the backside, and of course, it's a tedious journey to try to get this history in our current curriculum right now in the school, and it's almost like pulling teeth. And I spoke to this fact just last week, how we're working with school boards even right now to make sure that this information is taught in our schools, and not just during the month of February, because we do have a rich history that is hardly ever spoken of, even in the month of February. The history that we would want to, if we are not talking about this stuff in our homes with our children, they never know about it, because our school systems, for some reason, has failed to make sure that this part of our history is. And so, thank you for saying that. But we are fighting behind the scenes to try to. And of course, that costs money because books have to be written. They never were written correctly according to history. Of course, you know, they picked and choose what they wanted us to know about us. And so that's why, and I think Asia said it earlier, all this information tips, you know, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are searching and going as deep as we can to figure out who we were and who we are to this day, so that we can make sure that that part of our history never ever dies. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Velasquez. And our identity is ever changing, it's evolving, right? History repeats itself, so it's a continuum. So I want to thank you for sharing that and just inspire everybody else who's listening. There's a lot of research out there, and it was shared last night. Start reading books that are written in the voice of the people that we're trying to learn about. It's important to read books that are written by folks of indigenous backgrounds. It's important to read what's written from your own perspective, right? Because history gets sugar-coated and watered down a lot. So thank you for that. We're going to move on. Great conversation topics. Thank you again, Ms. Velasquez. Next slide, please. Go ahead, Pastor.
Thank you, Ms. Asia. So slavery, religion, literacy in this American South. And so one of the things that this slide does point out, and I really like this picture, because it's a really early picture of our people in slavery. One of the things that I really want to talk about is how the clergy used the Bible to educate and assimilate Negroes. Oftentimes, even though they were allowed to use the Bible the slave masters took out portions of that Bible. And of course, this is documented down through some of that history that we dug out. They still dictated to us what they wanted us to teach to our people. And so even though there are those who could read, they were limited in what they could disseminate to the people as far as what the slave masters wanted them to know. Another thing this slide shows us is that churches was originally segregated and became integrated, master, slaves. And so once again, they used the Bible, the word of God, by so many people, even to this day. So many of our current generation refuse to read that Bible because they consider that Bible to be what they call the white man religion. And the sort of questions, and of course we won't get into any theology in any detail, but the question is how could a God, how could a God of theos, if you will, said of God, allow people to be put into slavery and then justify it in a book that we're supposed to follow? And once again, we're going to talk about that just a little bit later. However, in this history, there were still nuggets in that Bible that we were allowed to use that still gave our people the hope of one day being free. And so Kirky joined together using the Bible to justify why slavery is immoral. And so even though it appeared that it was used to keep us down, but it was also used to lift us up. It was the first book that we were allowed to read and interpret for ourselves. And so even to this day, I grew up in a church where the pastor could not read. He had a third grade education. But when he opened up that Bible, he knew the words in that Bible. I don't know to this day how he did it. I don't know if he remembered it from Genesis to Revelation or if it was by divine intervention. But he knew every word in that Bible, but yet he could not read. And so going back to slavery, that Bible that we use today in order to assimilate our religion, and I have one here in my hand, and we're going to talk about religion versus a relationship a little later as well, because I don't want us to get hung up on this Bible, because I know a lot of our people have a problem with this Bible, and so we can get into that just a little bit later. But once again, it was the first book that Blacks were allowed to read to interpret for ourselves. We can't get so hung up on how it was being interpreted for us. And so that's why, we have songs like Still Away. When Blacks got together and they were able to still away to Jesus, as the song would say, they were able to interpret that Bible the way that they felt that God had called them to live on this earth. And a lot of times in that interpretation, it really showed them that once again that they were being treated unfairly and immoral. And so once again, without getting too deep into that, you cannot separate religion from slavery, and then also you cannot separate the way we were treated to the way that we taught our people on how they should be treated according to this Bible, if that makes sense.
And Pastor, can you talk a little bit about, we talked about the series that's on PBS right now, The Black Church, and how they use the Bible to actually justify that slavery was immoral. So you had like 2 or 3 conversations going on rooted in religion and Christianity about the slave, quote unquote, problem. You want to speak to that a little bit more? Yeah,
and that was an excellent documentary, and I would advise anyone who have not seen it to I'm sure they can look it up on the PBS archives. I was actually enlightened in looking at that in that piece, and thank Asia for reminding me that it was coming on. So me and my wife both we were looking at it. But one of the things that it brought out is how, once again, and even to this day, let me say this, even to this day, we still have white evangelicals, and once again, I don't want to cause any firestorm here, but we still have white evangelicals. In all of our struggle and in all of our fight, they are still staying silent as far as the plight of the Afro-American man.
Talk about it.
They are still using the same Bible that I stand up and preach liberation from to justify why we are treated the way we're being treated. They go all the way back to Abraham's sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And they talk about us being from the Cushite clan, which means we were, as a people, were cursed. And once again, God forbid. That's why it's so important that we really don't talk too much about religion versus a relationship. Religion really turns people off from the God of this Bible. But relationship says that you must get to know the man that we're preaching about, the man that we're teaching about for yourselves. If not, if you don't understand what you're reading in that Bible and you allow someone to dictate it to you, you may be sitting under a white evangelical who will tell you that slavery is okay, who will tell you that we as a black people or African American people or however you consider yourself or plagued with a curse because of who we were born upon her. And once again, we'll talk about it a little later in the second portion of our presentation. But this Bible really preaches more about liberation than it does about slavery as far as we as a people are concerned. And once again, I would encourage all of you to look at that PBS series, and I think you would come away from it more enlightened than ever before.
Okay, thank you for that, Pastor. Next slide, please, Daniel. This is you, Pastor. Talk about Go Down Moses. Go on, sing a little something for us.
I can't sing, but what I would like Daniel to do, if he can play this YouTube, and then we'll talk about the significance of the words of this song, because oftentimes in our songs, because once again, our people could not gather, and they were allowed to gather for religious purposes. But even in that, they made sure that they always had a white person or a taskmaster who was always watching over their shoulder to make sure that clergy or that minister wasn't giving them any instructions as to how they could escape slavery. And so oftentimes they have to put those instructions in hymns or in spiritual Negro spirituals to give them information, like Go Down Moses, or I'm going to lay down my burdens down by the riverside, or to the beat of a drum. There were messages embedded in these songs, and this is one of the songs. And I think we have a YouTube. Can we play that YouTube, please, Daniel? Please be patient with us. He's trying to get to it now.
Currently experiencing technical difficulties.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's give Daniel a round of applause. He in the background. He probably got 18 different things going on. Thank you, Daniel. We appreciate you.
Yes, we do.
And we appreciate everybody attending this afternoon. Thank you to you all as well.
There's a chat that, and I hope I'm saying her name, Malika. Is that correct? Am I saying that correctly? She says, who like part, it's a Pat Robertson. I'm sure she's referring to Pat Robertson, would tell you that the Haitians made a deal with the devil for their freedom. Yeah, what type of foolishness? What type of foolishness is that? But you're absolutely right. People like Pat Robertson and then other evangelicals will actually say things that are just ludicrous, if you will. And so once again, you have to be very careful who you listen to when it comes to spirituality and that gospel. All right, let my people go. And so if I can just get a few moments to kind of break down this Negro and the significance of this Negro spiritual. And so the opening lines, as we heard, tells Moses, leader of the Jews who was held as slaves by the Egyptians, to go deep into Egypt. Listen at the words, the land of the oppressors. In the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, it says God he chooses Moses to lead his people out of slavery. And in the song, Egypt may stand for the slave states in the Southern American South. And this assumption is reinforced by the use of the word down, since slave-holding states were referenced as being down south. And in this interpretation, that which you just listened to, Moses would be thought of as an abolitionist, if you will, one who helps slaves escape from the South, or as a political leader who fights for the abolition of slavery altogether. And then when you look or hear the second lines of this Negro spiritual, it instructs Moses to actually speak to the Egyptian Pharaoh, demanding freedom for the Jews in this case. In Exodus, God commanded Moses to say, "Let my people go," to the Pharaoh. God also told Moses, and you have to see the parallels here, he also told Moses to warn the Pharaoh 10 times of 10 different plagues that were sent by God to force the Egyptians to grant the Jews freedom. Because the Pharaoh failed to release the Jews, and once again, I'm not giving you a Bible study here, but you need to see the parallels here. Because he refused to release the Jews from slavery after each plague, except the last, Moses had to return to him repeatedly with the message, "Let my people go." And in the first stanza, the songs of the long O's and the O's sounds that occur are the words Moses, O Pharaoh, down, to create a sustained melodic effect. And once again, it really is a song to stir you up, or to stir them up. It really is a call of arms, if you will, to not only to the one that was sent to free them, but also to those that he was sent to free, if that makes sense. Lines 5 and 7, and we didn't really get into that, elaborate on the story of Moses by describing the condition of the Jews, or Israel, if you will. And once again, it really refers back to that passage in the book of Exodus, of when God sent him down to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. And so these songs, and there are a countless number of these Negro spirituals that are sung in the church, remind us and to keep us grounded, if you will, of the passage and what our ancestors had to go through to get to the freedom land, if you will. Thank you. Next slide, Daniel, please. And so in this slide here, and I'm missing a slide, but anyway, in this slide, it talks about every religion can trace itself back to African spirituality. And as you can see, it's this tree, and I talked about the Abrahamic religions. And so from that, we get, first of all, African spirituality is the root of it. And so there's a myriad of different names, and I don't have them all written down that we coined to African spirituality, but it really is the root of every religion on the face of this earth. It can be traced back to its very beginning days. Every religion, Catholicism, Christianity, Judaism, Islamism, Egyptian mystic, all those religions stand on African spirituality, down to the point where we're even calling ourselves Baptists. And once again, we'll talk about that a little later when we talk about our mother church here on the peninsula, how out of that one church, 21 churches were birthed out of that one church on the peninsula. And I have a list of it to show you that we're not making any of this things up. And so even when you begin to look at religion, and once again, we want to be careful when we talk about religion, because one thing that we don't want to push is religion versus a relationship. And I think that's where most of our modern churches get in trouble with, because they, most, I'm born Baptist, I'm a die Baptist, or Kojic or Catholicism, or whatever denomination you fit up under. And it really is not about that denomination more than it is about that relationship that you have with your God. And so in this, once again, Islam, Judaism, the reference to resurrection, we understand, our brothers, in our motherland, and then the indigenous people, and then the polytheist people who served many gods. Each of them had a relationship with the God that they served, and it was not necessarily called religion.
Mhm. If I could add just a couple of things to that, Pastor, we
Please.
see these themes that keep showing up. To go back to what Pastor is talking about, African spirituality. Here's one book that I have, African American Spirituality, Thought, and Culture. So even though we have our religion that is rooted in some type of Bible or the Torah or the Quran, we keep seeing themes that show up like fasting, right? Fasting was rooted in Africa, and different cultures and different religions fast throughout the year. Covering of the heads, right? That started in Africa. Wearing white, that is symbolic. You saw in the previous video, wearing white to grieve. And then we think about the griot, right? It's like the healer, the curandera. These are similar teachings that come out of Africa, where there is a chief or there is a leader or there is a pastor or a deacon, right? That upholds some type of leadership or power in the community, that has the ability to pray over people, has the ability to, people come and seek counsel from this individual. That too was rooted in indigenous African practices, right? These ideas of rituals, like, why do you light an incense? Why do you think you do that, right? Are you calling on the spirits? Why do they burn the copal? Are they calling on the spirits? These things all interconnect us. And some of them are just inherent. When there's death, what do? You bring some food, you grieve together in community. When someone's born or there's a marriage or a wedding, we rejoice, right? In community, we usually bring some food for that too, or a gift. So just seeing how we're not saying you have to adopt this notion, but to just be aware of the themes and the commonalities and how we're connecting this back to some African rituals and beliefs and traditions.
Thank you, Asia. Before you go on, and I would like to point out that Harriet Tubman nickname was Black Moses. She was considered the Moses of her time, and that's important for us to know.
And I do want to point out, Ms. Velasquez, you on fire, girl. We're gonna have you be a panelist next time. Why don't we
Absolutely.
talk about Black Jesus, Pastor? We're gonna talk about the hair that was like wool. We're gonna talk
Well,
about
listen.
Black Jesus. The church my
Listen.
grandparents went to did have a Black Jesus on the wall. I just want to say that, Ms. Velasquez. But you want to
Well,
talk about that real quick?
yeah. Well, actually, I wish I had the particular passage of scripture to read it out of the Bible to you. And when you begin to describe or read the description, when you begin to read the description that the Bible describes, once again, hair like wool, eyes like fire, feet like bronze, hands and feet like bronze. That looks to me like a Black Jesus. And once again, it comes right out of the same book that Pat Robertson and all the other white evangelicals preach from, but they do not speak about. Matter of fact, it's almost sacrilegious to say that Jesus was Black, unfortunately. However, the words itself in this holy writ right here, gives us a description of what Jesus looked like. And I declare, I was looking on my wall, make sure I didn't have no white Jesus in here. I declare. I declare that Jesus that's described in this Bible is not a white Jesus. No, but we don't talk about that. We don't want to offend people. And time out for us not offending people, especially when they are not speaking the truth to us. Thank you.
And I would just chime in, Ms. Velasquez, and I see Ms. Franklin has also chimed in. What power, when we go back to the question the gentleman posed early on about oppression and racism, right? So the power and the impact on your identity for you to be believing in a God that doesn't look like you, that is detrimental to the spirit. That within itself is meant and intended to break the spirits and the souls of Black folks, but it didn't, and it will not, and it cannot.
Absolutely correct.
I think there was a slide that we missed. Yeah, this is Pastor's slide right here.
Yeah, that was just once again the Christianity family tree and birth of black churches. That I found in my archives, and I just wanted to kind of show. I like pictures like this, and I have a whole bunch of them because really it shows we put on our Sunday best to go to church, and people ask us even today, why do we dress up? Why do black dress up to go to church? That was the only time that our people, our ancestors, were allowed to dress up in order to go to a gathering. And so when we come to church, even though we know if you don't have a suit, if you don't have a tie, if you don't have a dress, the Bible says, "Come as you are." But we were proud people even then. And when we gathered together on a Sunday or whenever, unfortunately, they allowed us to gather, we put on the best that we had to stand before our God.
Yes, and I also want to just talk about what we learned in that documentary, how there were a lot of like storefront churches that
Mhm.
came up, especially kind of pre-Emancipation Proclamation. There was the secret church. Maybe you was really going to the garden, but you took a left and you ended up worshiping with your pastor. And how we'll talk more about the Great Migration and how these churches, even, we always have our small kind of close-knit community churches and how that impacts these large mega churches that we're starting to see more and more. Thank you so much. Next slide. So I want to, we have a very knowledgeable group, so I don't want to be repetitive, so please forgive me, but a lot of you do know that even pre Emancipation Proclamation, we had a lot of Blacks or African descendants that moved throughout North America, went, like I mentioned, went all the way to Canada, went down to Mexico, were already in the West. But what we started seeing after the Emancipation Proclamation, and even though there was still slavery, that was just a document that was going on in Washington, D.C., we started to see a major exodus, and in the droves, hundreds of thousands, right, of Black folks that are beginning to move out of the South, right? And I want to just, I'm not a professor, so I don't have no slides with sources, but I read a lot. I look at a lot of documentaries, so I don't have exact data, but I just know what I know about the Harlem Renaissance, and I know what I know about the birth of Motown and jazz, and I know what I know about how people continuously were able to go to school and to have their own schools. So what we start seeing with Reconstruction at the turn of the century is awareness and the importance of education. So we've got the birth of the historic Black colleges, and we've got a lot of intellectualism, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and we see some women like Mary McLeod Bethune. Bethune-Cookman College is still going strong in Florida right now, to start thinking of how can we empower our people, right? We need to be educating ourselves. And
Mhm.
even though we had a lot of segregation and Jim Crow, and those of you who don't know about Jim Crow, it basically was born out of a lawsuit that took place with Plessy versus Ferguson. These gentlemen, he wanted to ride in the front of the train and basically told him, "You Black, you can't ride in the front, you got to go back here." So we start seeing lawsuits like that long way before Rosa Parks decided to not get up off the bus. So I want to also plant that seed when it comes to identity, how as a people we have learned to advocate for ourselves. As a people, we have always been involved in activism and resistance, right? So what happens in Reconstruction, and there's a good book, We Were 8 Years in Power. It's written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it talks about how for the first time we start seeing not just clergy, we see men of clergy, but we also start seeing men getting involved in politics, right? So this was like the height of between 1900s and like 1930s, before the Depression. More Black statesmen, right? We start seeing Blacks that are going to school, that are getting degrees, that are getting involved in technology, getting involved in education, getting involved in literature. And like I mentioned, the Harlem Renaissance, and why that's important to me is because this was the first time that we start getting documents of Black thought. We've got poetry from Langston Hughes. We've got dance from Josephine Baker. We're breaking the color lines. We've got Marian Anderson, right, singing opera and not being allowed to perform because she's Black, or being denied by the Daughters of America because she's Black. And what does she do? She sings her songs anyway, right, at the steps. So there's a lot of activism that's happening, but we don't necessarily coin it as activism because it's the 1920s. I want to keep in mind and just do a little bit more names that are thrown out. We have County Cullen. We have Claude McKay. These are poets. We have Richard Wright. We have August Wilson. We have Zora Neale Hurston, who's beginning to write in broken English, and that causes this big old stir with the bourgeois Negroes. Why is she writing in broken English? Well, she's telling her story from her perspective, right? So all of this is happening in the North, and then we have to understand that even though jazz is like this institution, to see a Black band leader like Count Basie, right? To see a Black band leader like Louis Armstrong be denied. Like, white folks want to come hear your music, but they're not going to let you come through the front door of their club. And how we combated that: spirituality, faith, and we knew our greatness. So I want to just put that out there because people see what we're going through today in 2020. This has been, again, a parallel. This is a continuum. So we talk about the Harlem Renaissance. And what's happening in the western part of the country is we've got folks that are coming to California, coming to Texas, and like Pastor talked about, and I'll talk about, my grandfather came out here from Texas after he was in the military to work at the shipyards. He worked at the Port of Oakland. So we see the Port of Richmond, we see LA, we see all the way up to Seattle, Washington, and Oregon. Black folks coming throughout the Dust Bowl. Some of them landed around here. Some of them made it to metropolitan cities. But what did they bring with them? So you want to think about that. Even though you're from the South, right? And some people came from humble beginnings, but they were then able to make a life because they were able to combat segregation. Not to say that there wasn't segregation in the West, but it was a different kind of segregation that they had to combat. So I also want to talk about one thing that really just touches my soul is all of the innovation. And I have a book right here. A lot of times we don't talk about all of the African American inventions and all of the prominent, groundbreaking research. Daniel Hale Williams performs the first open heart surgery, right? We don't talk about him anymore. This is a Black man. We don't talk about Percy Levon Julian, who was able to find a strain of penicillin to be able to cure all of these different bacterial infections, right? We might hear about George Washington Carver and talk about some peanut butter, but George Washington Carver was on that soy shit way before these vegans was doing hello meatless burgers, okay? He invented over 167 things with soy and peanuts. We don't highlight that. We don't talk about Garrett Morgan and the stoplight and how Ford, Model T Fords, and I could go back to the cotton gin. If you picking cotton from Cane to Cane, Eli Whitney may have invented it, but who was the prototype? Who was working his invention to make sure it was fail-proof? Hello? So I really think that's a piece of American history and technology and manufacturing where we don't give Black folks enough credit. Even Madam C.J. Walker, she was taught by Annie Turnbull Malone, right, who opened a school to talk about Black beautician, being able to be a Black beautician. And we could do a whole nother panel on hair. You want to talk about identity, just the evolution of Black hair, just in this country could be 3 hours. And I'm sure some of our folks here attending got some 2 cents to put on that. But even how we use shea butter now, where's shea butter coming from? Africa. So I want you to keep those things in mind and the stories that aren't told and the contributions that were made in America to make it so great. Hello? And how we cannot have that conversation without talking about Black intelligence. We cannot have that conversation without talking about Black innovation. And we can't talk about Black history and American history without talking about all the intellect and all of the early writings, those who decided to start the NAACP, these were educated Black folks. And we got to mention Marcus Garvey. We got to mention that there was some folks who was like, deuces, I'm out this mug, because this country was not made for me. So we had the Garveyites. We had several trips with people who came here and went back to Africa, and we don't talk about that either. So I want Pastor to talk about the war and the military, since that's part of your identity, and how that also shows up with the migration and identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Asia. And once again, I want to thank Asia. She doing a job and taking the lead on this. But before we talk about the war, I just want to talk a little bit about Black theology, or what I guess some would consider, what we consider Black liberation theology. And really it originated among African American scholars, back in the day of many years ago, and in some Black churches in the United States, that really contextualized Christianity in an attempt to help those of African descent overcome oppression. And it especially focuses on the injustices committed against African Americans and Black South Africans during the American segregation and apartheid, respectively. And if I may, I don't want to go down a rabbit trail, but I do want to chase this rabbit, just a little bit. One of the things, and I didn't really understand this, that my grandmother told me, like segregation was the worst thing that happened to she called herself Negro, to the Negro. Segregation was the worst thing that happened to us. And I was among the first one of the first that was bused from South Central Los Angeles to a white community. I was on that first bus. And I will never forget. They didn't say, we don't want you here, or they didn't call us an N-word, but they really said that, we do not want busing in our community. So they might as well have said that, we don't want you here. And so Black liberation really seeks to, non-white people from multiple forms of political, social, economic, and religious subrogation and views, which Christian theology, spews out to us as a means of liberation. And so when we look at that Bible and we talk about, theology, we have to that we're talking about a point of a historical, biblical perspective, and not from some evangelical perspective who is still trying to oppress us as a people. And so, once again, we talked about the description of Jesus in this Bible. And clearly, once you read this with your own eyes, you'll see that the Jesus that is referred to in this Bible is not the one that is preached across this nation in these multi-white churches. Even here in Salinas, and I'm going to say this, I might get in some trouble, but even in our mega churches here in Salinas, Compass Church and Celebration Church, some of you may be members there. Where were your leaders during the time when George Floyd was being killed, or after he had been killed? None of my white contemporaries
Not a one.
stood up and marched in those streets with us. I called them all. I asked them to come to prayer vigils with us, and none of them. One pastor told me that he was busy preparing his sermon, and that he didn't have time to march with us. And once again, I don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but when we talk about Black theology, we're really talking about Black liberation theology, a gospel that really seeks to set us free from the confines of those that would keep us oppressed. And I want to make sure that when we talk about World War I, World War II, once again, that was still an era. And once again, I don't have too much history on this, but I can speak to the point of when I joined the military. It was one of the only places, and of course, some of the history we've studied, it was one of the only places where, after the military had been integrated, where Black men were allowed to hold positions of prominence. But even then, watch this, even then, they were not allowed to command white troops. So you will have an officer and a black enlisted, but that black officer could not tell that white enlisted what to do. He had to get his instructions from a white officer. And so even though we were allowed to fight side by side, even in World War I, World War II, we were still not considered equals when it came to the structure, the rank structure that we had so rightfully earned. But there has been, of course, a major progress during those wars. And once again, Fort Ord, and I talked about this last night, Fort Ord was a major employer, if you will, of African Americans on the Central Coast, preferably, especially in Salinas. And so the military really was always an escape or an avenue, I should say, an avenue for our young Black men and women now to go in light of going elsewhere, if I can say that. There was a question I want to ask before I get us back to Asia about talking about the infrastructure. A question I want to answer. Someone asked me a question, and I don't have to see the name. It says, I was wondering, as a Hispanic, would I be welcome into a Black church? Jose. And my answer is unequivocally yes. One thing is that we do not discriminate against people coming through our doors. Black, white, and matter of fact, I believe heaven. Let me share a story with you that my father told me. He was a minister, and he was a minister of a prominent choir in Memphis, Tennessee. And the choir, I mean, it is saying so well that it looks like heaven. He said, it looked like heaven was going to come down. One white minister somehow came to the church, and he asked my grandfather if he would bring his choir over to sing for his white congregation, and of course he agreed. And after the Black choir finished singing, the minister says, "Oh, pastor," he was crying. "Oh, pastor, that I never heard so much stirring songs in my life." He said, "When I get to heaven, I'm going to tell Jesus to let me go over into the colored section to hear your choir sing." Come on now. When he gets to heaven, listen to what he said. He's going to ask Jesus to let him go over to the colored section so that he can hear that sing. What kind of foolishness is that? Who would serve a God like that? Yes, Sarah in heaven. No, who would serve a God like that that would even ploy that there will be a separation of races even in heaven? But this is how some, once again, evangelicals think. There will be no segregation in heaven, as well as there should be no segregation down here in our places of worship. And so once again, Hispanic, white, Black, rich, poor, whomever you may be, the real church of God doors are open to all. Asia, you're going to take the infrastructure and post-industrial revolution.
I had a couple. I wanted to open. Livisha had a comment. Livisha, did you want to speak to integration? She had put something in the chat.
Okay.
Livisha, are you there? She may need to be unmuted, possibly. I do want to talk about the power in segregation, not in heaven, but here in the actual life. Livisha, if you want to chime in, just go ahead and let us know. But I want to talk about the power in segregation, because what we also see with the Great Migration is, even though the South was very, colored, Negro, very segregated, that opened up opportunities for Black businesses to emerge. I talked about the Black schools and Black colleges. What we start seeing, there's another documentary, Driving While Black, and those of you who've heard of the Green Book. So as Black folks are traveling, there are safe places that are Black owned, where you don't have to go around the back to get a hamburger. And we start seeing commerce. And I want to also talk about the power of wealth and nationalism. And although these are big terms, but it's basically for us, by us. Black-owned businesses that are supported by Black patrons and how important that is. And when we're not going through a whole timeline of history. They talked about social movements last night, and hopefully you get a chance to look at that. But what we saw with the civil rights movement and this push for integration is we did lose some of that autonomy as Black folks, right? And we still grapple with that today. We have Black-owned businesses today, and we won't get in that because sometimes the shit don't come on time or whatever. But we have to see the importance in concentrated wealth. We have to see the importance and the role that the church plays in that too. And Pastor got 2 offerings, how those offerings feed back into the community and feed back into the members of the church, and why that's so important. And not just on a communal level, but on a national level and on an international level, why we need to be buying from Black folks. Because if we're not participating in that, we're participating in continuing a cycle of poverty, intergenerational poverty. So one thing that wasn't talked about with the World War I and World War II, my grandfather and a lot of men and women who came out of the military were able to get the GI Bill. So now you see this movement into the upper middle class, right? So you see the Black flight, there's the white flight, and then there's the Black flight. I don't want to live in the hood no more. I'm gonna go to the suburbs. You see George and Wheezy trying to move on up and leave the rural areas, right? Leave that whole ideology of having my 40 acres and a mule and farming and all of that to, I want to live over here with the white folks. That's a whole nother webinar that we can do. But what that does is it also impacts identity. Well, now I live in a better community, quote unquote, depending on how you define better. I live in a quote unquote safer community. That impacts your identity, right? There's this sense of separation. Maybe your children go to private schools. They're not going to public schools with the rest of the kids, and how that too impacts identity, what your children are learning, who they're studying with, who they spend their time with, all of that stuff impacts identity. And that's why I'm saying it's a continuum. So that was one thing with the military. We start seeing home ownership, right? And with home ownership over time, we start seeing the Black flight from predominantly low income Black communities, right? And how that's a detriment because we're not staying in some of those communities to be able to teach there, to be professionals there, so that people who look like us see people like us in those positions. And just in regards to infrastructure, they, from the Motor T to the Cadillac, whatever y'all, the Cheyenne, whatever y'all trying to ride and put some rims on, who built those roads, right? Who built the bridges? So we think about infrastructure, and we can also tie in how the Chinese were here and how they were breaking their back. We can talk about the chain gangs in the prison industrial complex and how a lot of America's infrastructure was built by Black folks. That's something else they're not talking about. And then I don't know about the Industrial Revolution because that was like late 1800s. And again, I'm not a historian. I don't know if anybody's checking my dates or whatever. But look at the influx of labor, the labor force. And one that I'm really familiar with is the Pullman Porters. We had a lot of Black men that were working on the railroad. And we start seeing, even before the civil rights era, we start seeing the garbage men, the truck drivers, the folks who work the railroads begin to organize and say, hey, man, I'm over here breaking my back and working hard. I need some rights. I need to create a union. So we see that with Asa Philip Randolph. This is before the 1960 civil rights. So we start seeing that Black men and Black women who are entering into certain workforces, white collar and blue collar, begin to organize and begin to basically advocate for rights, and how that too shapes your identity. We need to move on because I see it's 2:42. Thank you so much. Next slide. I think we're almost done. Go ahead, Pastor.
We've had a Luvacia say something. Luvacia, can you give Luvacia the floor?
Yeah, when I typed integration in there, it's when you were talking about how your grandmother said that one of the worst things that happened was segregation, but I was thinking maybe you meant integration.
You're absolutely right.
And
Yes, thank you. Yes.
It changes the entire perspective. Because what I wanted to piggyback on was
Yes, yes.
Integration diluted a lot of the blackness, the love that
Mhm.
Black people had from having Black teachers, Black doctors, Black businesses. That segregation allowed us to have that Black strength and Black unity, and integration is what watered down and condensed our Black unity. So integration was a huge setback for Blacks collectively. And so that's what I wanted to highlight, that because it truly changes the whole trajectory of what your grandmother meant by how
Yes,
integration
yes.
itself took that away. And I know for a
Yes.
fact, because I have conversations with a lot of people, and not a lot of Black women my age. I'll be 40 in April, but not a lot of Black women my age had the experience that I had with a lot of strong, powerful Black women growing up. Like all of my teachers were Black women, educated Black women. All of the women around me, my friends, they're, matriarchs in my neighborhood, Black, strong, powerful women. Like I had a lot of that influence around me, as well as being a part of the Coptic faith, where I went to church and I wore a robe and a crown, and I was called a princess. And the women in the church were monarchs and queens and priests, and we prayed to a Black Jesus. So I don't even have the same kind of like, I don't even know how that whole integrated whole mind frame even works, because I was groomed and molded and surrounded by a lot of powerful Black leaders, especially women, being a Black woman. So with that, it gives me kind of like a different outlook, and it also gives me a compassion and a understanding for those other Black women who have not had that luxury that I've had. So with that being said, that was highlighting how the difference in growing up in an integrated and a segregated environment, growing up as a Black woman in a more segregated environment, is what gave me that confidence as a Black queen now, which integration does not allow majority of the Black community. So that's what I was throwing that in there, because you had said integration, but I know you meant segregation. So that's all.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you so very much for I and answer big difference. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for correcting me and for making that clarification. It is utterly important that we understand that, because once again we had our own communities. We took care of our own people. We had our own stores, our own hospitals, our own banks, even our own. We bought our cars from our own dealerships. And so when that happened, it really crippled us and weakened our ability to stand on our own 2 feet in our own communities.
Can I jump back
So
in here
thank you for.
one last time, just one last again, and then I'll be through.
Mhm.
Just to show you, I took my daughter, my baby girl, she's 4. I took her to the dentist the other day. And when I walked in, they take the kids in the back and you can't go. But my daughter has like detachment. Like it was hard for me to just let her go in the back, and she was screaming and they were almost like just not compassionate or not caring or anything. I ended up leaving my daughter out of there, and now I'm looking for a Black dentist. And that's hard, it's hard connecting with Black owned businesses. And that's when we had that luxury of integration. That was, that was the only place that we can go, and it was trusted. You know, we knew when we took our Black kids into the doctor that our Black kids see another Black face and they can actually walk into the room and feel comfortable. So, you know, all of those make a difference in our Black children education and taking them to the doctor and all of that. So yes, integration. I would have loved to grow up integrated. That's my personal opinion. So I agree with your grandmother.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And so, like Ms. H said, we're getting really short on time. We have just a few more slides to go to. So I want to talk a little bit about the First Baptist Church of Pacific Grove. Here's a picture of the current church in Pacific Grove. And in 1907, as you can see, and I won't read the slide verbatim, but African Americans throughout the peninsula began to meet informally in Pacific Grove in a temporary location. And when this church was formed, this was the first African American church on the peninsula. And out of this church, over 21 African American churches exist in Monterey County today and providing leadership throughout the community. And I want to mention these churches because, you know, most of them, or if not all of them are still active, you know, at this time. First Baptist, Friendship Baptist, Community Missionary Baptist, Bethel Baptist, Ocean View Baptist, New Hope Baptist, St. James CME, Hayes CME, Greater Victory, Church of God in Christ, Emmanuel, Royal Family, Christian Memorial, and Mount Nebo are all churches that got their start out of this church and span throughout the peninsula. And so this church is deemed to be, or said to be, the mother church. And if it's not the mother church, it's definitely the grandmother church of every African American church on Asya. Next slide, please. When you talk about Black churches, we talk about the impact on local community leadership and in our Black churches or churches. And once again, I talked about Black liberation theology already, but I just want to pick some things out of this particular slide here that I wrote in last night. Once again, that theology, that liberation theology, strove to incorporate Christian thought into Black community legacy as a protest people, and also by recognizing the social power of the church. Once again, it within itself, you know, it offered within its four walls. The Black community was able to explicitly bring God into the daily liberation struggle. The church for the Black community is the first place where most people go to when they have problems in their community. I can't tell you how many times that we've had parishioners who've had children in our schools, you know, especially in our private schools here in this location, that I've had to go sit down with the principal with and say, why is this happening to our children in your school? And so the church has a vast impact on the local community and activism. Now, personal and national tragedy seems to cause a major shift in people's assessment of the church. And we saw that really in 9/11 and also in any other problems that we have, you know, nationally in our community. People seem to really flock to the church when we have these national problems. There's just something about the church that society finds in times of tragedy and hardship. This also and always fascinates me because the media and general public embrace the church or the ideal of the church during a time of crisis. But watch this, and this is what really baffles me. But in times of peace and prosperity, the church seems to become irrelevant again. Even you know, and one of the things that I really don't try to subscribe to, especially in a church which I'm over, is our politicians. I try not to give them too much of a foothold in our churches because you only see them during time when it's time for them to get that vote out. And my question to them, most of them is where have you been, you know, the other 2 or 3 years where we needed you? But regardless, it's double standard. The church keeps people grounded, and I need for us to understand it keeps people grounded and fleshing out the burden of life by providing a bedrock of faith and answer to humanity's deepest needs. And one of the things I want to make sure that I emphasize is that the church does a lot of good for our youth in our community. I mean, we're responsible for their education. And what I mean by that is scholarships. and they benefit. The youth of our church benefit from them being a part of our church. We've seen people from the inception of birth all the way through college, honestly. And so there are benefits of being part of the local church, and also having a leader who is vocal in that community that will stand up for our rights. One last thing I want to point out is that on January the 10th, 1957, following the Montgomery boycott, the SCLC was birthed out of the church. Also the NAACP, also the Poor People's Campaign. All these organizations had their start. Martin Luther King before Martin Luther King was an activist or anything else, Martin Luther King was a Black minister. And oftentimes when we're talking about that, we fail to recognize that he started in the church, and all these organizations started in the church. And so once again, there is a role for churches and the people. Poor People's Campaign, right, continues with William Barber or Bayboard. Thank you for that. It is still going on to this day. There's so much good that have come out of our churches and continue to this day. Next slide, please. Miss Asia, touch your time.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want you to kind of sit with all that was shared today and take a moment to think about what's come up for you as you watch this webinar, as you hear our participants share their thoughts and ideas, and you hear Pastor talk about the role of the church and the impact it has on the community when we talk about segregation and the idea of Black nationalism. We think about activism and how that's shown up throughout the history of America, whether it's post-Reconstruction or right now with Black Lives Matter. We want to talk about the importance of having Black leaders, Black congressmen and women, a Black president even, right? Well, that's debatable depending on who you talk to. Thinking about all the innovation and the inventions that contributed to the greatness of this country. When we talk about the Black dollar, right, and how powerful that is and how hard we've worked as a people to continue. And we especially have to honor Black women who were not only caring for white households, but also taking care of their own households, right? And how that too has impacted our identity. And how our African heritage continues to show up. And basically we have gotten this far by faith. In the essence of time, we did want to have another conversation, but I'll just basically close. Daniel, you can go to the next slide. And Pastor, if you have any final thoughts as we just reflect on Black spirituality today, if you can give some closing thoughts, and I'll just share. When you look at this image, we see Ilhan Omar, the first African Muslim congresswoman here in the United States, wearing her hijab proudly. We have to see the Black Israelites above, the first Black archbishop, right? So those who follow the faith of Catholicism throughout history, this gentleman, Wilton Gregory, the first Black archbishop. We look at Buddhism and Hinduism. There was something that came up in the chat about the deities and how we do see dark-skinned deities and those who are polytheists. We see them with darker skin. What comes up for you when you see that, right? And we see Bishop Desmond Tutu, global icon, and the Nation of Islam. When you talk about Black nationalism, we have to give them some credit. Despite their theology, they have been the longest running religious organization that has continuously kept Black dollars in Black hands here, led by Minister Louis Farrakhan. So Pastor, if you want to just give some closing thoughts, and then what we're going to do, since we do want to honor that 3 o'clock is the end time, we'll have Pastor leave us with a word, and then we had a video that we wanted to show. Go ahead, Pastor.
So once again, I want to thank each and every last one of you for spending these 2 hours with us, and thank Miss Asia, for her knowledge on the subjects, and for Daniel and Chaco and helping facilitate this. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I think we've said enough, but I do want to say that we as a Black people this far by faith. And so we can never ever forget. We can never ever forget, or never allow ourselves to forget, or the generations to come to forget. that all of this, and that last slide that Asia just showed, it shows all those different entities about spirituality. Please, 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 just that slide there. Please, whatever you do not allow yourself to get caught up on religion. There's not going to be any Baptists in heaven. There's not going to be any Church of God in Christ, any Catholicism. There's not going to be any of that. The only people that are going to make it to heaven, and I truly believe that there's a heaven, are those that have a relationship with the God that they serve. And so I want to make sure that as we close, that we close on a positive note and saying that all religions, once again, all religion, I'm using that word religion loosely, starts from our African spirituality. And we need to make sure that we keep that in the forefront of everything that we say and that we do. Thank you for your time.
Thanks again to everyone who made this possible. Thank you to the Monterey County Black and Brown Solidarity Coalition. Thank you to Daniel, Rosa, Senor Oscar Rios, who's doing the interpretation, Hermelinda and Philip Tabera, all our attendees. And we're going to just close. And I just ask that you all just pay homage, however you worship, however you give appreciations to those who allowed you to be here in this moment. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. You believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We'll believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Sing it with me if you like it. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. Cause to me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can but shed some light, I say, carry us through the gales. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to ya. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Then struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. I'm a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times I can be quite difficult. How about no man's word? We who believe in freedom cannot rest. Hear me talking to you. We who